Okay, this will be the last of the models of the sort of psychodynamic part of this class. We're going to talk now about Adlerian therapy, and this is founded by Alfred Adler, and he called it individual psychology, which personally I think that the name is not as sort of clarifying as it could be, and most people who do Adlerian therapy call themselves Adlerian rather than call themselves individual psychologists. So just remember, if you ever found this, create your own theory, come up with a good catchy name. Otherwise don't, and then people will call it by your name, and your name will be remembered forevermore as a piece of it. Alfred Adler, although he certainly was a psychoanalyst, and that was where his original work was, Adler was a colleague of Freud's. He, Freud, and Jung were all together in the Vienna group that met, on Wednesdays, to talk about psychoanalytic theory and practice, and they worked together and so forth. Although he worked with Freud, and most people would describe his work as psychodynamic in flavor, when I read Adlerian works, I've had some colleagues and friends who have led Adlerian groups and who have participated in Adlerian groups. I really think of Alfred Adler as incredibly well-rounded, eclectic, kind of commonsensical, and sort of the first social worker to really be doing therapy, but who was called, an analyst. So he really brings a lot of richness and a lot of different experiences into his model. And I think that's a very nice thing about his model. As most people read it, they say, gosh, this guy just makes an awful lot of sense. And there's very little that people will take issue with. He seems right on the nail, to hit the nail right on the head in so many places. And he incorporates pieces of so many current, alive and well models. And yet at the same time, people sometimes find it hard to remember that, and let's give Alfred Adler credit for that. And I think some of that is because it is so beautifully commonsensical. It's not weird, strange, and esoteric that we kind of forget where we got it from. It's like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. And so you kind of think you either dreamed it up yourself, or you think that you give credit to the cognitive behavioral folks, or you give credit to the Carl Rogers, you give credit to somebody, but you don't really realize that Alfred Adler actually, right back in the very earliest part of the 1900s, was having these theories and probably put them forth before the people who were crediting them with. While Jung and Freud both, to some extent, worked with clients who may have been from the middle and upper middle professional classes, Adler was just a social work kind of guy at heart. And so rather than keeping himself sort of, up on the hillside with a lovely office that was accessible to a few, Adler worked down in the streets of the neighborhood with the general public. He worked with people who could pay, he worked with people who struggled financially, he worked with adults, he worked with kids. So he was really sort of there in the thick and in the heart of things, rather than in any way, shape, or form being detached. And his reason for breaking with Freud was this, idea of social rather than sexual urges. And a very strong component in his model is this idea of social interest. And for Adler, if you're working with a client, by definition, for that client to be healthy, they must, by the time, if not when they come in, by the time they leave, they must have developed some of this thing that he refers to as a social interest. And a social interest is the sense that there's more to this world than me. And there are other people out there, and other people are really just as important as I am. And it is my responsibility as a member of the human race to do more than take care of me and my own. If I want to truly live a good and meaningful life, it is my responsibility to contribute to society in a valuable way. So he had a great sense of service about him, and really embodied that in his life and in his writings and in his work and in his theory. So that's kind of a neat thing that I see in him, as well as he really did do a lot of sort of what social workers do, which is kind of work with people regardless of their ability to pay, and really trying to help others to adopt a philosophy and a sense of values, as well as just helping people who are struggling, helping people to overcome mental illness problems or sort of strange behavior, but really said, if you're doing okay, you gotta give back. That's part of just being a good person. So some of the components that are most associated with Adler, he wrote strongly about this idea of inferiority and superiority. And he sees this as kind of a driving force in human nature, such that he says that what often motivates people to become who they become is a sense that I'm just not quite good enough, or there's something wrong about me in this area. And so if we look and we say, I'm not a very good reader, or oh, my math stinks, or gosh, I'm so clumsy, I can't do anything athletically, that we could either say, life stinks, or we could say, I really struggle to read. I'm going to apply myself really hard and see if I can master this. And that sometimes the people who take that attitude not only learn to read, but then they say, gosh, reading was really hard for me, but I struggled through it and I made it. Is there something about me that I've learned through this process that I could use to help others? My son's current school teacher is a prime example of that. She said that she didn't really learn to read well until she was in college, is as her story goes. And she said when she was a kid, she was dreadfully ADHD, and she was dyslexic, and she had these learning disabilities, and school for her was a horrible source of stress and problem. But instead of crumbling into a corner and deciding she would never amount to anything, she struggled. She had some teachers who were wonderfully gifted and really helped her. And consequently, when she was able to do the things she needed to do academically to master reading, to overcome some of her learning disabilities and compensate for others, she decided that she could take what she had learned about herself and about learning and apply it to other kids. And she's one of two founders of a very, very cool school for very, very kind of quirky, learning, gifted, learning disabled, all sorts of interesting kids who are doing outstandingly well, who struggled in kind of a mainstream classroom because a regular teacher who hadn't gone through her own inferiority didn't really know what to do with kids like that. But because she had struggled through her inferiority and had achieved superiority, which according to Adler is not like, well, I'm so much better than you are now, but rather just mastery. So that would be a far better title here, linguistically. It would be mastery. Because she had come through this inferiority and had achieved a sense of mastery, with all of these skills and abilities, she's now able to use that to this social interest to really make a huge difference in the lives of many, many kids. She used to travel the globe and teach teachers how to teach and publish books and made records and sang songs and all kinds of very cool things in order to help others learn from her experience and learn from what she learned so that they could help kids who were struggling. So it's just a lovely story of exactly what Adler says, that sometimes you can use that one thing where you really struggle and feel very vulnerable. If you can master that and overcome that, it can be such a great gift. Adler's theory also really looks a lot at this idea of responsibility. Adler had little sympathy for the victim stance. So if people said, my life sucks, and it's all because my rotten father never had any time for me. Well, Adler says, grow up. Your dad may have never had any time for you, and that's sad. At the same time, if you want to die at 95 having been grumpy for your entire life because dad didn't come to your Little League games, that's a very tragic waste of a life. Maybe you could say, this is very sad and I will grieve that loss. At the same time, I am responsible for my life. I have free will. I I can make choices to overcome this. And so Adler really helped people to do that in his therapy. His model is seen as being teleological. Teleological is instead of being kind of pushed from behind, if psychodynamics sort of sees us pushed by these forces of the id and biology and determinism and so forth, Adler's seen us more as being pulled. We're pulled by there's goals, there's a future, there's growth, there's who I want to be. And so we move towards something instead of moving away from something. And so it's a very positive, optimistic kind of model, which is growth-oriented. And so because we have the free will and we're responsible, it's up to us to determine who we're going to be. Adler says that what we are given in life, what we are given, which is, our height and our weight and our mother and our father and our intellectual capacity and the neighborhood into which we're born and our, all of those things, is not as important as how we use it. So that if you were born black or white or male or female or rich or poor or intellectually gifted or with a number of serious learning disabilities, it's what you do with that that really determines who you'll be and your impact on the world, as compared to saying, oh, well, this is who I am, so be it. But it's what you do with what you're given that's really important. And again, that's a very nice, optimistic opportunity for us to say, okay, what can I do with what I'm given? So perhaps, I thought playing basketball would be a great thing. And here I stopped growing at 5'1". What am I going to do? Well, I could moan and groan and complain, but if I really love basketball, maybe I could be a coach. Maybe I could, buy a team. Maybe I could coach, like tots playing basketball, because at least I'm taller than they are or something like that. But rather than grumbling about what you don't have or what you do have, what can you do with it? How can you use what you have to make yourself a good person and to help the world? So those are some of, and the last idea over here is this. Adler was the first kind of theorist of human behavior to really take a phenomenological look at things. And so what is a phenomenological look? That's when you look at people's life and experience, or when you look at the world from a perspective that says, each of us experiences the physical world or the social world from our very own perspective, instead of there is an absolute true world and everybody else is wrong. So that if you talk about Thanksgiving with your family last year, and there was 10 people there at Thanksgiving dinner, each of you is going to have a different story to tell about that dinner. And if you're like most families, you'll all argue about that Thanksgiving dinner. Well, now there is some objective reality, like did you have turkey or did you have tofurkey? But then there is so much as purely phenomenological. It was wonderful. Everybody got along great. It was terrible. We fought so much. Maybe the same objective reality, but different people experience it differently. That's a phenomenological approach. That's how when you have a couple come into therapy, he has his perspective and she has her perspective, and they're very different. And yet they can both be right. Because experientially, that's how they both perceive their relationship, or they both perceive that event in their relationship. So this, when you're talking about doing therapy, is philosophically, there are phenomenological approaches where you agree that there isn't an objective social reality which is truth. There is what each person brings from their own experience, from their own life, from their own wishes, from their own cognitions, to the situation, and then takes from the situation. That all goes through our own kind of our own filter that we have. Another thing that Adler spends a lot of time talking about, which is a very popular notion since my childhood all through, just I think because it's sort of enticing and interesting, is he really wrote a lot about the idea of birth order. And there are copious books out there, and there are television shows and talk shows and so forth, where we talk about the classic qualities of the firstborn, and the classic qualities of middleborns, and the classic qualities of, the lastborn, or the babies of the families. Firstborns generally tend to be known as the sort of achievement-oriented, serious types. Certainly there are exceptions, but that's kind of a commonality. When I was in my doctoral program, our statistics teacher, I think it was, asked how many of us are firstborns, and in a class of 20, goodness, I think 18 hands went up. We were in a doctoral program taking statistics. It was the serious, academically minded folks. Firstborns tended to be there. I had a student a number of years ago do a research paper on social workers. Social workers tended to be middleborns, and that was what her theory was, and her theory was the reason for that was because as a middleborn, you kind of need to be a negotiator. You need to sort of work things out, and you're kind of there stuck in the middle. Well, she studied social workers and found that in comparison with engineers, social workers were much more likely to be middleborn, and engineers were more likely to be on, I forget it was on which edge of it, but social workers were much more than engineers likely to be the middleborn person. So those are some just little empirical pieces of data supporting that Adler had something to say about when he talks about birth order and qualities and characteristics. It doesn't fit everybody, but it certainly does kind of ring true to a lot of us. When things would go wrong, when people kind of lived unhealthy lives, instead of Adler saying, aha, you're having mental illness, or you are psychiatrically disturbed, or something like that, he referred to it as, you have a mistaken style of life. And what you need to do is learn a different style of life. You need to get some social interest, you need to kind of look at things, and you need to go on a different path, on a more healthy path of life. So just change course. Again, very nice and optimistic and goal-driven. Adler looked at dreams the same as the other analysts looked at dreams and saw them as being important, but rather than seeing dreams in terms of going through a serious symbolic interpretation like his counterparts Jung and Freud would, Adler kind of looked at dreams as being rehearsals for future behavior. So if I have a dream about teaching a class, maybe it's a class I'm going to be teaching. If I have a dream about a talk with my mom, maybe somewhere in my unconscious I've been thinking I need to talk with my mom about something important, and I have a dream about it. Adler would see that as a rehearsal, sort of a pre-run through. Adler was also one of the first people to really sort of look at cognition. He looks at our self-talk. He looks at sort of how what we tell ourselves about things and how we can use our self-talk and cognition to help improve the way that we live. He teaches people skills. You know, if you have a mistaken style of life, what is a healthier life you can have? And let me teach you how to do this. His approach, it probably is making sense, is much more just sort of collaborative, laid back, and probably just sort of a friendly, easygoing approach. Rather than Freud, where you're lying on the couch and the analyst is staring, in the big back chair out the window, not seeing you and going in your best German accent. And Jung, who was probably a little more personable with the client, but still it was, I think, far more formal. Adler was more likely to sit face-to-face talking with a person, just tell me what's going on. And have you thought about looking at it this way? Well, what are your goals and where would you like to be in your life? So that really when you look at it, to me, although he's classified as an analyst because he does believe in unconscious and because he did work with Freud and was sort of lived at that time, and because he does certainly believe that early childhood experiences have a very strong impact on who we develop into becoming as adults, he also really has a very lovely eclectic approach with the idea of social interest and the idea of sort of values and being a contributing member of society, this phenomenological view on things, helping people to be responsible, avoid victim stance, don't blame others. And all this kind of stuff just makes for a really kind of nice, sensible, practical, pragmatic approach that many of us draw at least pieces from. And if you read it all, if you're saying as you read the chapter, goodness, this makes sense, I do this stuff. You are not alone in that perception. And that's what I want to say about Alfred Adler.